to this webinar on making sure nature-based solutions benefit everyone and how to prevent green gentrification. Para que sepan, contamos con interpretación a la cual pueden
Just so you know, we have interpretation services that you can access by the panel at the bottom by choosing the corresponding language.
Just so you know, we have interpretation throughout the webinar, which you can access through the interpretation, the globe sign icon on the panel below your window. Estaré hablando por ahora en español en esta sesión inicial.
For the moment, I will be speaking Spanish in this initial session. As you may know, we are recording this session, mainly to be able to record the presenters. If you do not want to be recorded, you can turn off your video. If not, then you can turn on your video and participate in the discussions as preferred. We'd like to ask that you keep your microphones off during the presentations, except at the end, when we will ask questions and provide answers. We will be here for approximately 90 minutes. If anybody needs a certificate of participation, please get in touch with the Interlace project through the address that you can see on the screen. For those of you who are with us for the first time in this series of webinars, City Talks, Nature City Talks. This is part of the Interlace project, and we'd just like to tell you a little bit about what this project and series of exchanges are about. The series for nature, we provided a video from the National Society of Governments in Costa Rica, which is also the directing entity, and they will be talking about this project.
Whenever you're ready, Felix. Thank you.
Interlace es un proyecto de cooperación internacional que tiene como objetivo restaurar y conectar entornos urbanos en ciudades de América Latina y Europa. Forma parte del programa de investigación e innovación Horizonte 2020 de la Unión Europea. El consorcio Interlace está integrado por 21 organizaciones de 11 países, en los que se destacan 6 ciudades: Envigado, Granollers, Cracovia, Chemnitz, Porto Viejo y Cebeima, centros de investigación, redes de ciudades y comunicación.
Como redes de ciudades, la Federación Latinoamericana de Municipios FLACMA y la Unión Nacional de Gobiernos Locales aportamos nuestra conexión y relación con los gobiernos locales de la región para que el aprendizaje y el desarrollo de herramientas que se genera desde Interlace lleguen a la mayor cantidad de municipios, facilitando y fomentando el intercambio de conocimientos y experiencias por medio de la comunidad de práctica, Ciudades por la Naturaleza, la cual lideramos en coordinación con nuestros aliados Climate Alliance y Ciudades de Gobiernos Locales Unidos, CGLU, a través de la organización de estos eventos virtuales y presenciales de diversas índoles.
Muchas gracias, Félix. Y bueno, como decíamos en el video,
Thank you very much, Felix. As we were saying in this video, this series of Cities for Nature is an opportunity to address different topics related to the restoration of urban ecosystems and nature-based solutions. On this opportunity, we will focus on green gentrification and ecological gentrification, and we will also, well, our panelists will explain in more detail what this concept entails and what the nature-based solutions and green initiatives seek to do to benefit citizens. For this, we have 5 panelists who you will see on the screen, and you've probably seen in the invitations. We have interns from different cities, from San Juan de Puerto Rico, from Barcelona, and also in the spirit of this project, we have researchers and academics from different cities who will present the report on pathways towards urban equality and territorial equality issued last year by the network, which I also work for. For this, we have Camila Cousinho. She is a researcher from the Institute for the Environment and Development, and Ana Calvetti Moreno, who is a research officer in cities and United Cities and governments, who will provide a presentation before we have the presentations from the cities of San Juan de Puerto Rico and Barcelona. We will end with the discussion in which we will collect your questions, and we will have Israel Angeloski, who is also part of the report that Camila and Ana Calvetti will be presenting, and is also the director of the lab in Barcelona for environmental justice and sustainability. So after this brief introduction, I would now like to give the floor to Camila and Anna, who will present this report further, and also the topic that this webinar is about, which is green gentrification. Go ahead, Camila. Thank you very much, Juan Carlos. I'm going to present in English because we've been asked to be able to balance out the languages for people who do not speak English to turn on the interpretation.
As Juan Carlos said, I'm a researcher at the International Institute for Environment Development that is based in London, but actually I'm based in Santiago de Chile, so working on more than one place at a time. As Juan Carlos said, Ana and I are going to present a little bit of the framing of how this idea of green gentrification was discussed in the context of the latest gold report that was published by UCLG, which was launched just in October this year, of which both Anna and I were part of the steering committee of that process. So I'm going to share a few slides with you. You hold with me for 1 second while I get this to work. So very briefly, you can all see that, no? So the title and the slides are as much as possible, both in English and Spanish, so you can all follow what is there. The title of this report that we just published in October is Pathways to Urban and Territorial Equality, Addressing Inequality Through Local Transformation Strategies. And it's a report that is every 3 years is published by UCLG, but when we started to develop this particular proposal about urban and territorial equality, we decided to do it in a slightly different way than previous reports. The focus of the report is in how local and regional governments can advance urban and territorial equality. And the way the report is organized is through 6 interconnected pathways. We decided not to approach the report in a more kind of sectorial way, in which we'll say, okay, housing, transport, I don't know, water, etc., but try to see how actually, because of the complexities of inequalities, the actions of local and regional governments need to be thought in a way that is more interconnected, less sectorial, more interdisciplinary, and so on. And the other thing that we did about this report is that rather than just kind of we as researchers taking the task of writing it in our own desk for 3 years and then return it back to the UCLG community, was to really open a quite wide co-production process that involved both members of the UCLG network and its allies and networks, but also members of civil society international networks. And here just a few images that show like the kind of engagements that we did. It was all, of course, during the pandemic, so it was all online engagements, but we were very happy of the amount and richness of that the contributions that fed into this report. That was not just about like bringing cases, but actually helping the steering committee to frame the focus of the report and to frame the messages and to frame the themes. So in this context, the report is organized in these 6 pathways that emerge from that very rich process of conversation. And the pathways names that are here, each of them try to capture different challenges, but also very concrete actions that local and regional governments can take or are taking to advance equality. So one is about commoning, that talks about issues of housing, basic services, land, and the way in which collective practices from the ground are actually advancing equality. There's one about caring, that is a very important theme for UCLG and how cities can be more caring towards their citizens. One about connecting, one about renaturing, one about prospering, and one about democratizing. And the one that I want to talk to you, and Anna is going to go more in detail, is this one about renaturing, that actually was curated, because we didn't have chapter authors, we have chapters curators, because they were working with so many inputs from all these other organizations. It was curated by Adriana Allen, Mark Swilling, and Isabella Agelovsky, that as Juan Carlos says, is going to be commenting at the very end of this session. So renaturing, or renaturalizar in Spanish, that of course is a bit of not such an easy concept, but something that was important for us is that each of these verbs, each of these actions were all seen as pathways, as roads, as ways to advance equality, not as something on itself. So when we thought about the kind of how we want to engage into the more environmental agenda for the report, it was important for us to capture something that wasn't only about greening, or wasn't only about bringing questions of environment, but that captured the complex relationship between environmental and social inequality challenges. The report provides, for instance, a little bit of a framing of why renaturing. I put the slides in Spanish, but I will present in English. The why renaturing, and the why renaturing is not only the impacts of climate change and the challenges for cities, but also is the unequal distribution of the risk and impacts of climate change. And that unequal distribution is as important as the challenge itself. Just to put here a couple of questions that are in a way the starting point of the argument of this chapter that we are discussing here. On the one hand, it's like, how can urban system be reintegrated into natural system, sustainably including the green in the urban and the urban in the green? So it was always this kind of more territorial view of like looking at cities and natural resources and rural territories as part of a continuous system. But the second question is, how can territorial economic dependence on natural resource and extraction be transcended while also tackling the uneven distribution of risk from marginalized groups such as displacement, gentrification, and commodification? So it's in this interaction between environmental and social challenges that this report emerges. And just to conclude, before I pass to my colleague Anna, who will take you more into the kind of green gentrification conversation, we wanted to show this diagram that appears quite early on in the chapter, that explains how these pathways for local and regional governments to advance towards equality by renaturing actions need to consider both the kind of equality inequality question and the sustainability question, because I think the main message here is like, not every intervention in a city that has a sustainable agenda necessarily consider questions of inequality. You can have interventions that may have a super interesting and rich renaturing kind of ethos, but because it doesn't consider the unintended consequences of an intervention, may in practice in turn be reproducing inequalities or deepening already existing exclusions. So the balance between these interventions that advance towards lower inequalities and more sustainable interventions is what the authors call this just and sustainable urbanism. That is the question of green gentrification in a way fits into this paradox in the way of how do we avoid those unintended consequences that have consequences in terms of inequality, for instance, through gentrification and forced displacement, by these more green, environmental, sustainable agendas. And with that, I will pass to Anna.
Thank you, Camila. So yeah, I will pick up again Camila's idea because this is critical for today's conversation, I think, and for the renaturing pathway that she advanced. Like, how can we green and decarbonize cities and promote equality at the same time? This is the main challenge. Because again, there's a risk that cities could be greened, but yet still remain unequal. And they could become more equal at the expense of their ecological systems. So focusing now on green gentrification, we approached it in the Goal 6 report as an unwanted impact of urban renaturing efforts, like other impacts like the commodification of vital ecological systems and services, the overconsumption of resources by the few, and the externalization of risk to particular social groups and geographies. We know that gentrification today is broadly instigated by these neoliberal practices, investors, developers, which contribute to the financialization of urban land and housing. But governments also provoke this, for example, through their land use regulations that favor the interests of luxury developers, high-income residents, which lead to rent increases, inflation of property taxes, loss of traditional sociocultural practices. So the causes of green gentrification are actually manifold, this is not new. As said, they usually include the misunderstanding or the disregard of everything that is at stake, particularly in terms of equality and social inclusion.
Anna, can you just double check I'm on the right slide? Sorry, I think I lost track of it.
It should be slide 11 now.
So let me...
Yeah, that's the one.
Yeah, sorry, please go on.
Just wait, I don't see the slides anymore.
No, that was me.
Okay, so let's go to the previous slide, maybe. There we go. So positive pro-environment progress, like the promotion of green neighborhood rebranding or transit-oriented development and the regeneration of urban areas, may lead to gentrification and expulsion. With regard to adaptation, mitigation, and resilience, solutions may include green belts, rain gardens, permeable pavements, and green roofs. And all of these policies seem positive, right? Like enhancing urban nature, protecting the citizens, lower investments and running costs than by using gray infrastructure. But again, they may provoke this green gentrification. So it's important to think like which citizens are we protecting the most with our policies and who are we forgetting? Now, moving on to the next slide, we would like to focus our attention on several of these causes that you can see on the screen. First is the historical disregard for nature in urban and rural planning. There's been a lack of territorial approaches that consider the interdependence of urban, peri-urban, and rural areas and their respective communities, the workers, and the resources. Also, failing to recognize informal uses of the public space or not hegemonic ones in terms of leisure, recreation, traditional agriculture, farming, etc. This leads to expelling those citizens who make such uses, and this promotes, again, inequalities. More broadly, the implementation of green planning agendas without the participation of the local communities, especially those who are socioeconomically more vulnerable and marginalized, provokes such devastating impacts that we have all heard of. And also, as resource scarcities kick in, like insufficient water, expensive fossil fuels, rising food prices, these also translate into higher prices that benefit the rich and further exacerbate existing inequalities. And also, we need to consider the generalized adoption of this language of ecology and sustainable development, this kind of branding that does not pay attention to all the elements that we have described. Because again, not all local governments give priority to or manage to prioritize equality in urban renaturing. Greening cities are often embedded in historic or new socio-spatial inequalities that are underpinned or created by continuing urban growth, land speculation, and social segregation. It is important to understand that green gentrification takes place in different areas. It may happen in previously forgotten city centers that are now being revitalized, for example, in Copenhagen, where the Norrebro, I don't know if I said it right, but this district was rethought to attract talented people, creative people, young people, and it ended up being only for elites and visitors. But it also happens, gentrification also happens in non-central districts, like working class neighborhoods, informal settlements have tended to benefit less than privileged areas from access to green space, healthy food, and other natural amenities. And many marginalized communities suffer from a historic green deficit. For example, this is the case of Baltimore in the US, which due to a historic legacy of environmental racism and racial segregation, those historically Black, centrally located neighborhoods are the ones with the highest prevalence of smaller, more crowded, poorly funded, and under-maintained parks, because greater investment is destined to predominantly white areas. But still, these neighborhoods can be gentrified. And this is what happened, for example, in Rio de Janeiro, in the favelas, and in the working class neighborhoods of the metropolitan area of Medellin, which now have been beautified and aimed for middle and upper classes, visitors, and tourists. And also, we do not have to forget about the rural gentrification. because the development of land-intensive renewable projects, including biofuels, large solar panels, this enriches the elites, generates displacements where rural communities struggle to maintain access to land, and increasingly causes environmental disasters, which raises questions of environmental justice. And we have plenty of examples of this, like in Myanmar, in India, etc. So what solutions are being given by cities and regions? So there was a 2021 report entitled Policy and Planning Tools for Urban Green Justice, in which researchers from the Barcelona Laboratory for Urban Environmental Justice and the city network ICLEI analyzed 50 tools and regulations that are available to cities and that you can see on the screen. These included rent controls and freezes, compulsory and ambitious levels of inclusionary zoning, density bonuses for developers, development taxes, freezes or cuts in property taxes in gentrifying neighborhoods, rental vouchers, community land trusts, among many others, embracing rights-based approaches, pro-poor policies, and the participation of communities themselves. 3 cities that have achieved combating green gentrification are the ones you see on the screen: Johannesburg, Portland, and Vienna. As you can see, they have included inclusionary zonings, pro-poor policies again, the right to return, affordable housing, participatory processes, etc. And what these experiences have in common is like their emphasis on ensuring that environmental improvements are not pursued at the expense of equity again, and that the right to affordable and safe housing is prioritized. They advance the right of everyday city makers whose practices are often dismissed as being informal. And now we will make a point on the 15-minute cities that you might have heard of as policies that prevent or maybe perpetuate green gentrification. But I think in the interest of time, otherwise my colleague Juan Carlos will tell me off, I think we will just leave the question open for your reflection and maybe get back to it later. Camila.
Thank you, Anna. And also in the interest of time, I'm going to keep this very shortly, but the chapter and all chapters include this question about like what these pathways are composed of, what are the different actions and the different messages that local and regional governments can move on for advancing those pathways towards equality. You can look at more details of this in the report that is all available online. Of course, it's very small here, but just to capture in 4 kind of main key messages that I think close the chapter in a nice way. One, it is that it's necessary to give a serious consideration to fostering and supporting the capacity of local and regional governments to have more complex governance process, more complex ways of collaborating across different actors. The second one, it is understand that better urban resources flows and for infrastructure and for planning are necessary, which usually require joining international, national, and local networks to advance in such efforts. The third one is about that it is key to create an integrated perspective that ensures that the expansion of greening is predominantly about social inclusion and reconnecting everyone to natural systems and not just a few that are privileged to do so. And the fourth one is the idea that bringing social justice into the renaturing of urbanization will always require a combination of local regional governments actions with civil society-based actions that are at the end of the day, those who have been very much at the forefront of pushing these agendas. Thank you very much. And I hope we can have a rich conversation with the 2 cases ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much, Camila. And thank you very much, Anna, for that very easy to understand explanation of the complexity of the green gentrification processes in both like its more kind of specific definition, but also in the broader implications that it has. And like as they were saying, this report, while you were presenting the renaturing chapter on how to look into renaturing from that social justice perspective, does include many other chapters and many other pathways to urban equality that I think throughout the 2 presentations we will see are all very much interconnected. And this is the case particularly of the next case that we will be looking into from San Juan de Puerto Rico, where we kind of see a very clear example of what you were mentioning, Camila, at the very end, of local governments working with civil society from the very beginning of this process of envisioning a renaturing or restoration process. So for now, I would like to invite Estrella Santiago Perez from the Enlace project in San Juan de Puerto Rico, who will explain us a little bit more about this, like I think, very many years long process happening in San Juan de Puerto Rico in an informal community context. We will be looking later at the city of Barcelona, and I think it will be very interesting to contrast those cases, the different approaches, and go back to the discussion that Anna and Camila were putting, inviting us to reflect on. Estrella, the floor is yours. And just so you know, Estrella will be presenting in Spanish. So if you want to switch on the English interpretation, please go ahead.
Buenos días a todas las personas
Okay, good morning, everybody who is here. Thank you very much for inviting us to this forum, and it's a pleasure and an honor to be able to share this with the panelists. Thank you to Juan Carlos and to the Interlace or Enlace project members. You know that in our country we speak quite quick when we speak Spanish, so I'll try to be slower for the purposes of interpretation. My name is Estrella Santiago Perez. I'm the Manager of Environmental Affairs at the Corporation of Enlace project in Martín Peña. For those of you who don't know, Puerto Rico is here, located right in the Caribbean region. As you may imagine, we are an archipelago that is exposed to a multiplicity of climate-related events, and we are being impacted by the effects of climate change. Therefore, the issue of restoration, mitigation, adaptation to climate change and these events, and the prevention of gentrification, thinking about the communities, is something that is closely linked to us and is prevalent and is not a new issue for all of us. Particularly, the project that I work in is in the estuary of Bahía de San Juan, of San Juan Bay. Therefore, our communities are right at the heart of the only tropical estuary contained in the program of the Federal Agency for Environmental Protection, the EPA, in the US. And as you can see in this image, the estuary covers a significant percentage of the north part of the island of Puerto Rico, although Puerto Rico also has islands that are municipalities, and the Canyon Martín Peña, which is a district where we work, is located right in that part which connects the estuary, the east and the west of the estuary. So this estuary is of great importance at the level of the ecosystem. It's environmentally very relevant, of utmost importance. It's a habitat for multiple species, even many that are endangered, including both animals and plants, but also at the economic level, it has a high value assigned to it because the estuary is located at the international airport, Muñoz Marín, which is the main airport of Puerto Rico. It's also located along San Juan Bay towards the west. And Puerto Rico imports many of the products that we consume and use, and many of these products come through the boats, through the Bay of San Juan. That's why it doesn't just have ecological value, but also economic value, this particular region, and the fact that we are right at the heart of it. Our communities were mainly established in the 20s and the 30s. These communities were established in the marshes that previously had mangroves, but before the establishment of these communities, there was already a culture of exploitation of these wetlands since the colonization of the Spanish. And after the 20s and 30s, there were some policies that were implemented to eliminate the wetlands because of the malaria mosquitoes that prevailed. And so the government imposed policies to eradicate them, and also that due to the lack of jobs in rural areas after the hurricanes in San Felipe and San Cipriano in the 40s or the 30s, this led to many families migrating from rural areas of Puerto Rico towards the city, looking for better and new employment opportunities. Nevertheless, Many families came to the metropolitan area of San Juan. There were no houses available at the time, so they would establish in these plots of lands that nobody wanted, and in this case in the wetlands. So the first houses, and there are historical accounts from residents that still live in the communities about how their families used to fill these wetlands with soil or trash, and they would build their wooden houses above the water itself. But the government definitely intervened here. The first communities of houses that were built during the special process in Cayo Martin Peña, where we work, were built by the government of Puerto Rico, and then the other communities, 8 communities, were established in their own development process. Therefore, this intensified the impact on the wetlands, and at the same time, it created the need to create projects to promote the infrastructure of these communities. So after the 80s and the 90s, these communities started a reorganization process, which resulted in the creation of 2 organizations and legal mechanisms that allowed caring for the different issues that they were facing. So the construction of the waterway in the area for the communities, and also decent sanitary conditions for housing, water services, and socioeconomic development. Therefore, the community started to organize. They created G8, or, well, the group of the 8 nearby communities in Caño Martín Peña, with community leaders, and they were composed of 2 grassroots organizations, including the community boards of the 8 communities from nearby communities to Caño Martin, to the canyon. So it's a highly participatory process, and the G8 created by way of the law, through the work of the project, a public corporation in charge of managing infrastructure projects with the community, as well as restoration of of ecology, socio-economic development, among others, which communities define as necessary to address their issues. And through the same law that created the corporation, they also created the trust of the land of Caño Martín Peña, which is a tool that the cities decided to have through participatory process and assemblies and community meetings and workshops. And they decided that this would be the mechanism that would allow them to ensure that the implementation of projects that address their communities, so that they would not result in community displacement. And multiple allies have joined the project, as well as employees from multiple social fields. The communities created a comprehensive development plan. It was created by way of participatory process that lasted 2 years, from 2002 to 2004, which is a plan that regulates the projects that are ready or that are lacking to promote infrastructure and housing in Caño Martín Peña. So they don't just formalize participation through the institution or through the corporation, but the communities also develop planning documents for urban planning or land planning in a participatory way. These communities face a multiplicity of challenges at the economic level, as you can see the image.
And also there are some communities, as you can see in this map that you have on the top, that don't have infrastructure because the development project on a physical and spatial level was informal. So those are communities that have constant flooding with water that is not properly treated, and flooding that is impacting the health, at the same time are impacting the health of the ecosystem, because there are some unhealthy water that are going to the Martin Peña Canyon. And we have had some study with the universities that have shown that living in housing that is closed or in flooding areas during rain, that it should not be a hurricane or a storm, it can be just a 5-hour long or 1 hour long rain. The fact that your house is flooding increases the prevalence of having GI diseases, asthma, or skin allergies, among others. So the comprehensive development plan that I previously presented, it's including several projects to tackle all these issues of lack of infrastructure. One of the main elements is the channeling of the Martin Peña element to open the body of water and restore the ecosystem, not only in the body of water, but also in the other components that are part of the San Juan estuary. This is a project that has been worked with the community for 10 years already. It is a work that we have had to do with a body of engineers of the United States, and in that itinerary that we have on the screen, there is a single example of all the main processes that have been tackled with this project and that have taken on the disbursement of funds so that we can start with the construction stage. The feasibility study of this project was developed by the corporation, by the communities, and you then know the body of engineers of the United States. You know, there is the federal agency, the one that is in charge of doing these environmental studies. We wanted to do it to ensure that the planning and the conceptual design worked with the reality of the community, and the community participate on knowing what is the pipeline that we want as soon as it worked. We have done resettlement projects and house acquisition, guys, in people that is working in the restoration process or other infrastructure process. And this is clear, the trust of the land trust, because we don't want to take people out of their communities. So the trust is that tool, and later on we'll talk about that, is that element that allows to resettle families that needs to be resettled due to the project that we mentioned in the district communities, if so they choose. Each family choose where they want to move, they choose the house, and the corporation grants everything from the current structure, the moving to the new places or others. Those are houses that have some sanitary resources, where we have had more than 600 different acquisitions of eligible elements. More of them have decided to stay with the trust. And the key to do this in a respectful manner to help that all the families is we have a resettlement committee that is done by leaders of the community. Some of them have been resettled as part of the project that have been mentioned before. So we have a comprehensive vision to check everything. We see this in a comprehensive manner. And the trust fund, as I mentioned, has been this tool to prevent displacement, given these things that we have to implement, and has become even more relevant considering the current market and the short-term element, and the fact that these communities are located in the equivalent to Wall Street of Puerto Rico. They are next to the banking area. So this is the area that for decades has been subject to land mongoose. And in 200 meters of land, they have been transferred to this trust fund, and is a collective holding of the territory. All the families have a surface right that entitles them to the right to the property. However, the land cannot be sold, so the land is protected. And that means that people can invest. The increase on the value of the land for the property allows us to have houses available for the inhabitants that are going to be resettled, and protects the communities from the displacement that has been seen in neighboring communities. So there has been a whole process on the creation of trust. This has been an innovative model to avoid gentrification. It's not the only model, it's the model that these communities choose, but this has been a process, a participant process. More than 200 families have been part of this trust. There are some fiduciaries that decide how this process is tackled. And it's a mechanism that has been threatened because it goes against all this capitalist perspective of having individual property. We are rethinking about how can we protect the community and how can we reprogram a personal vision. Now, I'm not talking about my area. all our inhabitants, all the people are part of the owners of these, and what do we do to improve these territories? So it has been a beautiful process to work with the communities and this experience of the people that have resettled themselves in the community, given that we had a trust fund, and how we're seeing that after Hurricane Maria, having a trust fund has helped us with all this process of grant in the short term, and how this is working for resilient elements for companies that are resettled as part of this process. The largest process in terms of infrastructure had been handled, but we have more than 16 development elements that are impacting inhabitants alone. But if you want to know more about the project, we are giving you more information about this process, and I'm open to see the question. And thank you so much for this space and time. Thank you, Streja. And I know it's difficult to present this process that is taken so long with so many different players at the time. So as you say, if you have a question about how the process was working and how all the elements were projected, the idea is that we can check them later on. You can check them in the chat, and we are going to gather them for the conversation later on. As it was mentioned, this process in the trust fund in the different communities is a process on a specific area of the city, is an infrastructure project, a restoration project, and within a context of neighborhoods that were done on the construction. The second case that we're going to see, and that takes us to another continent, is the case of Barcelona, where the process of reinventing the public space is going on a scale of the city, and with many of the notions that have already been mentioned by Anna that were concluded in the creation and inception of this idea. And we are seeing the planning many years, thinking that even in the urban process around the Olympics is working. So thank you so much, Rosa, for being here and for showing this new model of the city. Again, if you have questions about this presentation, you can add them in the chat, and we're going to see the presentation later on when we are with our lecturers. Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon. We are going to share the presentation. Thank you so much for the organization for this presentation. Our case is very different to the case that was presented by our friend from Puerto Rico. Barcelona is a European city in the Mediterranean Sea, and it has a metropolitan area of 36 municipalities of different measures, but the entirety of the population is 13 million inhabitants in a rather small area of 633 square kilometers. Specifically,
no pasa. Ahora,
sorry, it's not moving. Now, the city is a heavily dense city. It's a city that is bordered on the east by the Mediterranean, by the west by the Colserola mountain, and on the north and south by the rivers, the Solja and the Obregat River. And in this moment, practically 100% of the territory has been occupied. The origin of the city is the old hub, then it was medieval, and many towns that were around that at the end of the 18th century, 19th century, were united through the enlargement that I guess that many of you know, the Sarda enlargement. The city has 1.6 million inhabitants in a surface of only 100 square kilometers and a density of 15,000 inhabitants per square kilometer. Is divided in 10 districts that have certain governance independence and 73 neighborhoods from 15,000 to 30,000 inhabitants. The program Superilla appears as a way to try to rehabilitate the city. A city that, as we said, has already been done, is already finished, that doesn't have growth spaces. It needed, given different reasons, a restoration, a rehabilitation, especially considering that we can have a more resilient city. In these moments, what we are trying to do is trying to do a safer city that favors the relationships that have been lost in the last century, that works with the proximity market, and that first of all takes the responsibilities of the most vulnerable elements that so far haven't had a response in the planning of the city, as children are the elder people or people with disabilities. The Superilla program is a strategy to achieve this result. What are the indicators that have shown that we have to consider seriously that the city needed our rehabilitation? Well, we have a city that is in the border and many different elements. High pollution elements, saying that every year that we have 3,500 premature deaths related with pollution of 10 particles of NO2. Then we have a huge deficit of green spaces. In Barcelona, we have around 6 square meters of space per inhabitant, with some other neighborhoods like the enlargement, where we are around 1.8 square meters per inhabitant. Then we have a high degree of acoustic pollution, given the sizable amount of traffic that we have. We have half the population with levels that go to 70 decibels. There is a large amount of accidents every single day. The worst year that we have, 2014, we had within the city 11,000 wounded people given to traffic accidents, and also a problem of we don't have a lot of public space where to move, where to do exercise, that 1 out of 6 children in our city are overweight, for example. There is an example, the heat wave. We have 4 degrees hotter for us than the rest and a high emission of CO2. And these would setting into crisis the current city. And these are the guidelines that are joining the program, the Superilla program. The program that is focusing on the management and on the new way to control the public space is accompanied by a series of parallel works that are centering the actions that have been proposed. And in this moment, we are talking about the gender organism, the virtues of the green, the rationalization of mobility, the new urbanization, how we have to urbanize the new streets of the 21st century, and what is happening with the housing policies, with equipment and the government, and how we have to participate in all this process. Concerning gender urbanism, we have set in the first place in a way to focus with this, the care and the daily life. We want to move from a city that has been designed for production, for the movement from a house to work, with a very male sexist perspective of what has to be a city, to a more feminine vision, to a city where the important thing is what we do in a daily life, what do we do on taking care of the elderly, of the young children? So taking into account these new criteria makes that the design of these spaces and the way to develop them is entirely different. It's a project, it's a program that takes into account the inclusive urbanism principles in terms of transversality, in terms of openness of the proposals, on the scale going from a local scale to the flexibility in time. So because we are in some liquid periods of the constant changes, and therefore the solutions have to be flexible, sustainable, of course, and interdisciplinary as well, and participative as well. We have created an urbanism manual of the daily life and a practical guideline of integration of the gender perspective that somehow is guiding all our actions in the public space. The green, the benefits of the physical and mental health, both personal and the planet. In a city where we have these, the different districts of the city, and the percentage of the green space per person, as we said before, it goes between 2 to 6, 7 in some of the most favorable districts. This makes that we have to consider how can we give a greenery to the city. And for these, the program Superillas, what it tries to do is to create a new infrastructure of the green that connects our natural system, the mountain and the rivers and the others, that we can have green spaces moving 200 meters away from our home, that we have more surfaces and more green planted and shade areas, and also the permeable area that is one of the main causes of our effect of the heat island, that we increase the diversity, that we can create spaces of a climate comfort, of an adequate climate comfort with the new climate crisis that we had, reducing the sound pollution. These are elements that are aiming to improve the environment. And how we do that? This is the green spaces of Barcelona currently, where we can see the scarcity that we have. And this is the proposal that we do. Now that we don't have large areas to transform into parks or new spaces of the entity, what we try to do is that we try to transform the streets. The streets of the city is making a selection, is transforming it into green corridors with great presence of vegetation, and that aim to distribute in a homogeneous manner the differences of this infrastructure. So the intention is to create in all the city 184 kilometers of streets of this fashion, so that you can see we have more problems, more environmental problems in the temporal sector than the peripheral area. For example, the central area that we can say that is the ancient and the elder part of the world, talking about more affordable, better types of the city, is not the best in terms of environment, is the one that has more transit, is the one that has more deficit of green spaces, and the one with more pollution. In this case, it would be difficult to unbound the topic of improving the green areas with the richest spaces. So we have a crown of peripheral neighborhoods where we have better environmental conditions. Also places to be, areas of leisure and public areas. And now in terms of pollution, you see the center, this is a difficult area, the most difficult area to work with in terms of pollution. The other important work line is the improvement of mobility. Many of the causes of these negative elements goes in the time mobility, of cars that we have in Barcelona. Even considering the central area, we currently have more than 355,000 vehicles in a day. This is what generating environmental important problems. So the goals that we have in the Superilla program is to reduce the speed and to reduce the capability to cover the city in a car. So creating and to compensate a network of roads, something for the pedestrian and for the car, for sustainable elements and active mobility methods. So what we want to do is to diversify our daily talk in different levels, from some basic roads, something from the public transportation, up to some roads that are more pedestrian, where we can recover a lot of space for many users that are not the ones that we currently usually have. Therefore, what we do is that we try to give to every mobility system its own fare and space, so that in a moment the space is clearly occupied or by the car. This is the scheme, the Superilla scheme, that, as we said, is about guaranteeing the roads and moving from the current model that all the cities are the same and all the cities have the same capability for the car that we had, and unlike a lot of VNN, and sorry for the pedestrian, moving to a model where we have some essential cities for the public transportation, some others that are essential for the for the movement of people, and some others for some local levels. When we do this way to organize the management of the space, something so simple, we generate a possibility of being able to make a space as something natural for some other uses that are very important in a city that doesn't have many other options. And this case is the proposal of this green axis of the pedestrian area, where the car is just a guest in the most dense area of the movement. We have the proposal. The proposal is 21 streets of this case in a vertical and horizontal level, and in the crosses of these cities that we currently have great asphalt islands, we can create squares of 2,000 square meters that give the way to create leisure areas or playful areas and a better greenery. With this proposal, only in this area of the city, we increased 33 hectares the space for pedestrians and 6.6 the planted green area. These is the diverse studies that we just have done, the premature deaths that we could avoid with the application of the Superilla model in all the cities, the deaths that can be avoided every year, given that it will increase the physical activity, that we will have more greenery, that we will have less increase of temperature, and it will reduce the pollution level and the sound pollution level. On the other hand, another of the lines that we have is the street as such. How we design these streets, the streets that we want the go to work as the lung of the city. These are streets that we are moving from the section that we have to from the left to the right. And we had four roads and two trees with some 5 meters areas. Now we're moving to other way that the specific platform. Then I have problems with the architectonic area with a better presence of the greenery, and where the car can go to these areas and just through some specific blocks and something heavily delimited, so that they are never a problem to move if you are not going to do something concretely in this work. And this is a bit the image of the places that we currently have. we have some corners that given by the Sardab plan, and we find these 2,000 square meter areas where the traffic is not even covering these areas that are doing neighboring activity, because the traffic is moving on the lateral without being able to move in the middle. These are images of the street. In the left, we have a current area, and as the area that we currently see is under execution, we have the image of a crossing with the image in the bottom. Then at this moment, we have 4 of these elements that are being executed. Now, concerning housing, what are we doing in parallel? On the one hand, the diagnosis of Barcelona concerning the link between doing improvements and the effects that they have on the housing and the commercial houses is evident that in a commercial system like the one that we have based in offer and demand, any improvement action that would be necessary would create an appraise of the assets, and that creates some differences as well. So that's what we are trying to do. We are trying to make that these improvements are not focused, but they are homogeneously distributed. Barcelona is a city with a lot of pressure because it doesn't have a space, room to move. It doesn't have a lot of public housing. Only 1.7% of the stock of the houses are public, and they represent a 4.4 of the renting house. There is a huge touristic demand because we are a city that is ranked in the touristic terms, so especially from the Olympics of '92, and is gathering the services of all the autonomy of all the autonomic region. Therefore, it has a lot of pressure. Also, the, the town hall has the duty to regulate these things, the rental areas or the property areas. Also, doesn't have a lot of coverage there. Anyway, what we have been able to study is that in cases of pedestrian streets that have been seen before, we have detected that in some cases, 30 or 40 years later, as is in the central area of the town hall, we have detected that this has had influence in the appraisal of different areas, but it hasn't had a lot of influence in the price of the housing nor on the renting. Anyway, we believe that still as of now, the value of the house is bounded to the same characteristics to the surface, to the area construction, and to the connections that they have with transportation than with the relation that they would might have with the environment or the greenery. In any fashion, as we mentioned before in the Superia program, we try to fight these in terms of homogenizing the improvements and that all the streets have an attractive, a concrete attractive. Now, in terms of the action of the mobility, in the places where we have implanted superillas, we have done different actions. In commercial terms, we have suspended licenses. We are changing the uses, the commercial use, not to create ghettos of some climate-specific treatment. We have worked with everything that is the terrace of the buildings and the others that were provoking certain specialization of certain streets, some uses. And we have regulated these in terms of the specificity and the municipal work with the private work. Now, in terms of the housing, they have done touristic work to hamper the movement of people of the touristic work that was being issued. This is absolutely regulated nowadays, and the creation of housing, of school, of hotels, and the possibility of empty buildings to incorporate the social renting
en ciertos solares para prever la posible actuación de vivienda social y de compra de estos solares previamente a la implantación de superillas. Luego
with the participation of Superilla, and we have some series of help for the different participants. We have accompaniment and action in terms of mobility. And one of the main cores that have been done, it has been a normative that has been essential in the whole state, that is moving 30% of the new elements that are done in the city of Barcelona, both new and new constructions, and as the new rehabilitations that are more than 600 square meters.
de protección.
70% of housing for public protection. This allows us to foresee, and this has just been for 2 years that it's been effective, but the idea is to get 300 public protection houses per year. Another important point is that we have started implementing operations for recon, and Barcelona, the idea is that it will prioritize when a plot of land or when a home is sold, they want to put in an offer before private enterprise. So this means that, for example, here you can see the area that's been marked for the last year on this PowerPoint, where 22 plots of land have been bought with 22 houses. And we've also bought houses that are separate from others, and also the right to enjoy the property. This has been done within a plot that has already been created, it's already consolidated, and has very low capacity in Commune 7. Sorry for interrupting you. If you could maybe conclude in 1 or 2 minutes, we would be grateful. Okay, well, there's a series of aids here, or resources that have been provided for the rehabilitation of the buildings, as you can see here, for the property owners themselves. In terms of accessibility, we obviously try to ensure that all spaces are barrier-free, to make sure that there are places where people can engage in leisure. And these roads become school-run paths that bring together different facilities, and there are also pathways with assistance. And this allows for the increase in the social relationship between the different people in the neighborhood. This is the distribution in Barcelona. Our distribution is quite homogeneous in terms of facilities. The 15-minute city in Barcelona is truly a reality. Commerce and retail, we're making sure that there is proximity in comparison to the large surfaces or chains, in terms of how easy it is to get there, providing greater visibility in these streets, which is very important. And it's also important to rationalize all loading and unloading operations. And as a final point, as I was saying, this has all included participation. Before implementation, we work for about a year with the neighbors of the neighborhood where we are implanting the project. And we also have a series of meetings at the city level, different lobbies and general collectives. Therefore, this program really takes all of this into account. Thank you very much.
Gracias, Rosa, y disculpa por cortarte
Thank
un
you,
poco.
Rosa, and sorry for cutting you short, but we just want to make the most of the last few minutes. Yes, it's quite hard to summarize. Sorry about that. Yes, no problem. It definitely is a challenge that we've set out for you all. But it's very important, as you mentioned, I guess it's a very different context. And the approach is to bring green zones to the entire city so that these green spaces can benefit everyone, focusing on the current context of distribution of green zones, and it's the proximity city model that you want to follow. But I can see that, for example, there are common factors there in San Juan and Barcelona, because you both mentioned the impact of short stay rentals and tourism and tourist attractions and in the city, and that kind of fact that both have, as well as proximity, speculation in terms of housing and in the plots as well. I want to go back to one of the concrete questions that we have about the projects before we move on to a more open discussion. Rosa, we have a question for Rosa. I want to respond for Rosa and also Estrella. Are there any observation instruments that measure the socio-ecological issues that these issues generate, or any mechanisms to address these, taking into account that the seguridillas have been pilots for many years in Barcelona? And I'd like to give the floor to Rosa and then Estrella. You spoke about the community organization, but the restoration project, and this is a question, does it emerge from the activities of the communities or from the organization of 8 neighborhoods? Was that more of a response to the idea that came out of restoring drainage and preventing the super impact or the high impact that this could have in the communities? Go ahead, Rosa. Okay, well, on the topic of how follow-up takes place, we have an indicators plan that was designed to follow the Superillas program that touches upon all the different topics. So public space, transit, the environment, and also how the population evolves and how the social level changes, and also the price of renting or buying both housing and commercial stores. The idea is to follow up on that, and the information will be published each year. We don't have much of a history because we have implemented this for a short amount of time, but we think that after the most recent implementation, which was quite significant, we will have more robust data. But we do have a kind of whole series of indicators that have been designed to be able to follow this process. Thank you very much, Rosa. Before we give the floor to Estrella, I'd also like to make the most of this to welcome Isabella Angelovsky from the Social Justice Lab in Barcelona. And maybe after Estrella, you can tell us a little bit about these indicators. I know that you've worked in a number of cities, and as part of the project, you've been looking at the distribution of these environmental benefits. So maybe you can give us a bit of a vision about how to measure this, or how it's been measured in the renaturalization project, so the redistribution of the benefits. I know that's a huge question, but we can definitely start the conversation going and get a bit more out of the renaturalization chapter. So go ahead, Estrella. Would you like me to answer the question? Yes. So after Estrella responds the question after or about whether the communities came first or the restoration project. Okay, so on that question, our communities are located 2.2 miles approximately away from a canyon of 3.6 miles in size. So let's say that there had already been restoration in the canyon towards the end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s, as a result of that restoration project that took place by the Department of Public Works and Transportation and some engineers. Certain communities were displaced. They were kind of at the margins of the canyon, including the Toquio community. So the communities from our portion of the canyon, when they saw the displacement process as a result of the restoration process, they decided together with the support of a number of people, including the Javier Rodriguez del Valle, so the planner and the social worker, Okote Muraye, and also Officer Miriam. They decided to create a planning process to be able to focus on another part of the canyon. So the restoration began before that, but nevertheless, there were also kind of in parallel towards the 90s and 2000s, there was a community reorganization process as a response to that. So they kind of proposed how they would continue with the restoration project with the community movement. So geographically and in comparison to the information provided by Rosa about the extension or the size of Barcelona, we are a very small community, but there were 8 communities that were communicated beforehand, and though it seems strange, right, that certain people did not cross over to the other community because it was another community, in our case, it was also a process in which each community had to organize among itself to cooperate with other communities that they didn't used to have communication with. So it was like a symbiosis between what was happening with the restoration at the time in the western part of the canyon and the impact that that had on the communities that previously disappeared, and how this promoted internal organization and inter-community movement in the district, and at the same time other components of infrastructure development and socio-economic development were integrated as part of that, as a result of this process. And it was a continuous process. There's no kind of perfect formula for that prioritization. It's basically a congruency between a number of mechanisms that secure the participation not just of adults but also of youth, girls and boys, and we believe that they also have the right to a voice in this process. I don't know if that answered the question. Yes, perfect. Thank you very much, Estrella. And then we will come back to this point later because I can see there's another question about the involvement of the community and the best mechanisms. And I think that we can ask in both Barcelona and San Juan this question, but going back to Isabel, I wanted to look at the question about the indicators or the mechanisms that have been used to measure the impact of green gentrification, also taking into account that how Camilla and Anna mentioned these are processes that aren't just about the value of the property, but also access to environmental benefit systems. You can speak in English or Spanish as you prefer. Well, okay, however is better. What's better? Probably English to make it a little bit more dynamic. Okay.
So the way in which we have worked on trying to assess green gentrification has been in 2 different ways. So on the one hand, what you need to do is have a full mapping of all green projects that, for example, a city has developed over a certain period of time. So parks, small gardens and recreational areas, playgrounds, community gardens, greenways, urban forests, etc., and be able to geolocate them on a map and at the same time assess their date of creation. Okay, so that's, let's say, what you're trying to understand has been done at the green level. But then if you want to see, okay, to what extent does that contribute to gentrification, you have to create gentrification indicator. And for us, this indicator is really important that it doesn't only look, for example, at increases in housing prices, but it also looks at changes in demographic composition of neighborhoods. So for example, is there a lower number of residents with no university degree that lives in a certain census tract? Are there greater numbers of white residents who are living in a certain census tract in a certain moment in comparison with before? And so you have this composite indicator, which is going to be, let's say, a total of all of these demographic and real estate changes that you have to measure at very, very small scales. And so preferably census tracts or block groups, or, just the very, very small scale so that you're really able to see what's happening in different parts of the city. And so once you have let's say the mapping of all of the green spaces and the mapping of gentrification scores, let's say, you have to construct quite complex statistical models or spatial models to try to see the extent to which green space explains that gentrification score. And so you will have, measures at the very local level of a census tract to, for example, if you have like a park and a playground and new greenways together, you can have a look at them together and then you can see what happens around in terms of gentrification. But what we've done is try to do it at the citywide level. And so with these very complex spatial models, we've been able to really isolate the impact of greening on gentrification, controlling for other variables, meaning there could be other variables that explain gentrification, including new transit, new real estate developments, or just simply proximity to the city center. So if we take those into consideration, but of course we measure greening, where do we see that greening impacts gentrification? And so the result of a study that we've done in 28 cities is that we see citywide trends of green gentrification in 17 out of those 28 cities, mostly North America, but not only.
Thank you very much. No, that's very interesting, and yeah, it goes like right into the question of going beyond the house pricing, the rental pricing, and looking at that from like the social inclusion demographic point of view at the city scale. I might want to go back into that final comment you made on the cities to maybe look into what was identified as kind of key factors that might differentiate those 17 cities where you see green gentrification taking place than those that do not. I do know that the in the renaturing chapter of the Goal 6 report, the engagement between civil society and local governments was pointed out as a very important point. So I would like to go back to that question that was put in the chat of what has been the most efficient mechanisms to engage the community in these two projects that we were discussing today in Barcelona and in San Juan de Puerto Rico. So maybe this time, Estrella, you can go first. As I know that you had to wrap up that slide very quickly in terms of what mechanisms you have used to engage the community, especially looking into those that maybe were not active already in those aid community, like the community groups that are part of G8. So how do you reach out to other part sectors of the population that might not have been actively engaged from the beginning?
Pues ahí, en el caso del cañón.
Okay, well, in the case of the canyon, there are multiple mechanisms. It's difficult to define them within the short time we have, but the key here has been, as an organization created by the community, to work at all the spheres, so work on participation, so all the way from our board of directors, where most of the members have to be from the community. When we hire employees, we have requests for proposal, and the committee must be made up of members of the communities. And we also look at non-traditional angles in participation, such as violence prevention programs that take place through the Office for Citizen Participation. So through sports, for example, which are kind of the hook to involve many young people, there's a double impact there through volleyball and handball tournaments. And we make sure we integrate them through workshops on participation issues, on violence prevention, and that's how we start to work with the younger population so that they can become leaders or active members of their communities. We also have the Líderes en Acción, or Leaders in Action program in the Canyon with young people from the ages of 10 to 18. And after 18, some of them even continue in the program. They meet up every Friday during the academic year to talk about socially relevant issues, and this has been registered as a non-profit organization, so they participate in decision-making processes within their communities. And that's another route that we use. And for many residents who perhaps don't have the time or the energy to become community leaders and represent their communities in each process, because obviously it's a voluntary task which requires a lot of effort and time, a Canyon program has been created where on each street we identify residents who are kind of leaders, and they help us spread information, summon people to community action, and many other things. So there are lots of ways of promoting community participation, and we have to identify these spaces that already exist in the communities. So it's also about facilitating that participation. If there are churches, for example, these are centers for community participation, and working with community churches was part of the key by way of which G8 was created. One of the co-founding leaders, who is the current president of G8, Lucico Rivera, started to do that through the church. So that's how she activated young people, because her mother was also a leader in the church. And that's how we fostered participation. So through these church spaces, we made the most of the schools as well, and people who have been active, because we can facilitate the process of them becoming representatives of their community. So there are lots of different routes for that. I've left the G8 page in the chat where you can find a bit more information about this organization as well as the initiatives that it implements. Okay, thank you very much, Estrella, and thank you very much for sharing that link with us. Rosa, would you like to mention anything about that? Because this was also one of your last slides on the participation mechanisms.
En nuestro caso es un poco diferente porque
yes, in our case it's a little bit different because we are parting from a program which does not have concrete action in principle, but rather it's focused on city transformation. So we've had to work at two levels. One is more at the discussion, debate level, so presentations and exhibitions and explaining our intentions to different general collectives from around the city, which could be trade organizations or retailers organizations or organizations at the level of mobility, the donas, the ajovas, the associations of people with disabilities, because we have found a problem, we have faced a problem, namely that many of our citizens didn't find it necessary to do anything. So it's very different when you have a concrete issue that needs to be resolved, as Estrella says, which is a land planning issue for a particular channel, which, you know, when you have a consolidated city that's been working for many years, or and which for certain people works very well, other people at the same time are complaining because they want more green spaces and less pollution, but it's not a generalized issue. So you have to really do lots of explaining, lots of teaching to really make these issues evident and obvious so that people can be positioned and truly participate either in favor or against that after they have received knowledge about it, which at the point of entry they do not have. Therefore, our job at that level, at the city level, and at the level of changes for an entire city has been exactly that. And then at the other level, or at another scale, a more detailed scale, in terms of people who, you know, decide to pursue specific action in a street or a square or in a specific space, people who are directly affected for better or for worse, because every person perceives it differently. That includes other participation, a different kind of participation. So the end communities from that particular area, so going neighbor to neighbor, where we've had lots of different meetings on different subjects, and we've gone to each store explaining what it's about. We've heard very specific and concrete proposals about how to deal with a specific street, for example. But at this level, you can't reach this level if you haven't first worked at the general level. So one of our biggest challenges has been raising awareness or being able to explain why we were doing things or why we were proposing certain things and what the effects were that we wanted to counteract. Okay, thank you very much, Rosa. Yes, and I think that, as you mentioned, that's something that we have felt in the political discussion of that vision, and yes, the newspapers as well. And we don't have much time left, so I think that we will go back to Isabel with the last question so we can start to conclude the webinar. Maybe Camilla and Anna can add something if they want to at the end. And we're going back to the question, Isabel, about, in the cities that you've seen, that you've studied, which mechanisms have you identified that might help to prevent green gentrification? And also, what are the limitations that you have found in the actions of these actors at the level of local government and others that depend on other factors, as we were saying before? So, for example, the housing market, which is controlled by capitalism and kind of something that lies out of our hands. I think that the example that Rosa just gave us about Barcelona is very attractive. So the mayor's office is very proactive, it's progressive, and it's been chosen for the just green social platform. And this is something you don't find in many mayor's offices, so that's why it's very important. And the action, for example, that Barcelona and other cities has put forward to try to salvage protected housing and control further the new housing that's built with the 30% law. So these are important measures. In Nantes, you have this as well, but in Nantes, you have a lot more post-industrial space that still needs to be built. So you don't have the historical areas that Barcelona has. And then there's another issue that I don't understand in Barcelona, which is that a great part of the citizenry, as Rosa was explaining, and at the same time, the media have literally created a campaign against environmental urban health. And this is just really annoying because unfortunately Barcelona is a highly polluted city that goes beyond the OMS or the WHO's levels, but at the same time you have media campaigns that talk about protecting the rights of each person having an individual or a private car. And so we're basically saying that there are sources of pollution that aren't difficult to identify, i.e. cars, and they need to be drastically reduced, especially in the center, because it's unbearable in terms of health and say environmental and respiratory health, and also in terms of noise pollution. So that's something that is a challenge for us in Barcelona. So having an inclusive green city with and paying attention to housing in a significant way, but at the same time you have a heavy weight on your shoulders, which is the opposition that tries to disprove of the process, which I think is a historical process where there's a paradigm shift. And so I think it's very unique and it really surprises me a lot. But at the same time, it doesn't surprise me because since the current mayor was elected, there have been campaigns against everything that she does in a rather personal way, and that's been going on for 8 years now. This goes against, or this is contrary to feminist land planning led by her team, which is very sad. But anyway, we continue to fight for this, and that's the important thing, I think. There's a large part of the citizenry and a growing part of the citizenry that is in favor of these measures. What we've seen in cities that are better able to fight against green inequality is that they have plans for use. So when you redevelop a space that's very codified and strategized there should be a balance in the type of use. So when you distributing that between utilities and housing and green spaces, and this needs to be decided in a top-down way. So I'd like to repeat the example of Nantes that has a program called TAC. It's basically a territorial plan where they dictate exactly what kind of use will be made of the city. For example, having where people have single crops like American cities, or where you have tourism in certain cities, which you could find in a number of European cities, you have a codification, or you have codes issued by the mayor's office or the metropolitan area about what's going to be done with this space. And as a real estate promoter, you can use, for example, a specific space in one way, but those who will dictate the use of that plot is the mayor's office or the entity that does the land planning. I think this is essential. And in many cities, it's much more about assigning plots in a much more ad hoc way or informal way. And this leads to much speculation about the territory. So these instruments are important.
The regulation of all the rental prices, as we see in Berlin, a great protection to protected housing or public housing without dismantling the programs, the essential programs. As in Spain, we didn't start with a protected housing. It was just 2-3%. Something shorter than Vienna, Copenhagen, or you have some conditions that help you, but we have to protect it. In Copenhagen, we are dismantling these programs of public housing. What we do is that we are also protecting the public stock, the public housing, as we see in New York, in other parts. The New York Housing Agency is protecting these, and this helps to have a more affordable house in terms of prices. And there are some taxes that are varied to different types of companies. For example, some large companies that leave empty buildings, or real estate agencies or groups that are only buying luxury homes for international investors that don't do anything with their houses. This doesn't happen in Vancouver, that we have empty houses tax. So you have different instruments that have to be balanced and considered to be able to have a better work for a house that is very expensive as time goes by. Thank you so much. I have seen that in the chat you have shared some of the results, some more details. So we are going to gather this link to send to all the participants. Thank you so much for waiting for us and for staying here for 10 additional minutes to listen to all the comments. I would love to continue talking with you, but part of the goal of the interlink of the conversation that we have of practical communities working for the nature of having these conversations around the reindustrialization and how nature-based solutions can help everybody, and how can we avoid these issues that we have.
The next upcoming events. Y sí, bueno, como les comentábamos al inicio,
as we were telling you before, this series of Cities Talk Nature is created as a practical community within the Interlace event that works with 3 European and 3 Latin American cities, and a consortium of academicists, of investigation of different groups and different networks. This series of seminars, the next one, we have on the application long-term of nature-based solutions, something like looking like the example of Barcelona, about what type of examples in a city we could have, so that we can have a wider, more strategic vision for the naturalization and not only concrete projects within the city. Now we also have an event, an in-person event that we are going to have in Chemnitz in Germany, that is going to have an interpretation in English, German, and Spanish to see how we're going to explore the possibility of tapping the potential of the cities, and where we're going to talk with the cities that want to formally be part of this community to work with these and to participate in this first event. Having said that, I want to thank all of you for participating in this webinar on Cities for Nature, and I invite you to explore the interlaced projects that we have. And I guess that tomorrow we're going to be sending you a link with different elements that have been presented on the different practices and some of the reports that are going to be discussed in the end with the recordings of the webinar. And I hope that we can see them in the next item, the next events that we have. Thank you so much.
Gracias.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I think that you had to leave because of commitment, but thank you so much. Thanks to everybody, and thanks to the interpreters for being here.